I've been very fortunate to have some really extraordinary teachers in my life, and I'd like to speak today about three of them. The first one is Dr. S. Ramanathan, a musicologist and a musician, a vocalist and veena player of Karnatic music. It's often considered South Indian classical music. He was an extraordinary educator. He had people in his class of so-called several levels. So a performing musician who was very proficient, and a child and a beginner who was just learning the beginnings of Carnatic music in the same space. There was one occasion I remember when it was the first time I'd seen him stern or annoyed or angry even in the teaching learning situation. So all the adults, including the performing musicians and the proficient musicians, were singing one note, and this child was singing a different note. Normally, that child would have been diagnosed to be tone deaf and probably needed special attention for making sure they sang the same note as the others. So the adults in that room started tittering, and Dr. Ramanathan was very stern. He scolded the adults for tittering, and he said, "Did you actually hear what had happened? Did you listen? All of you were holding one note, and this child was holding a very different note. This child had already started exploring Western classical music, where you have harmony, counterpoint, dissonance, consonance, where there's one note and there's another note. So he didn't even hear it as tone deaf. He didn't even hear it as a deficiency. He heard it very differently as a remarkable occurrence in the music that was actually taking place. So one thing I learned also was from Professor Eleanor Duckworth. She's a renowned educator, a dear friend and mentor, and we've spent many years traveling together, doing workshops, conferences, and involved in teacher education, etc. So one of the extraordinary things about Professor Duckworth's groundbreaking work, it's come to be called critical exploration, and she's written a book called The Having of Wonderful Ideas. I think one of the extraordinary aspects is this sense of awakening or occasioning wonder, and wonder that takes us to a direct contact with the subject matter, with the materials and the phenomena of the world, not the authority of the textbook or the teacher. So Eleanor is not on a pedestal, but really occasioning the having of wonderful ideas and the having of wonder. And I found this remarkable sense of wonder, not only in the formal settings in which we've worked, but this awakening wonder in informal settings when we've gone on a walk together, noticing things. So the sense of wonder being permeating all of life, really. And I'd like to very briefly share a quote and add to that. So Eleanor asks, what on earth is teaching if telling someone what you already know doesn't help their learning? So I'd like to add alongside that this quote, which is, when schools' teaching, learning, and curriculum are so resolutely structured around what we already know, what would it look like for not knowing to be the point of departure for teaching, learning, curriculum, school, and the whole of education? The other person I'd like to speak about is was an educator and educationist, and some people would consider him a philosopher. Some would call him an iconoclast. And one of the things he suggested was that he sort of turned things on its head. There was a lot of discussion about truth, about different parts leading to truth. All paths lead to truth. And in this context, amidst this discourse, he turned that on its head and said, truth is a pathless land. It's not a fixed point. If it were a fixed point, you could have as many paths to it as possible. And I think the strongest metaphor I have of Jiddu Krishnamurti as a teacher is that of a mirror. It wasn't the common notion of a teacher pointing to a fixed truth, and we don't have to focus on the finger, we have to look at the moon or the truth. But it was the sense of awakening or mirroring to oneself what was actually going on. Awakening a sense of insight and intelligence. And the notion of teaching as mirroring. So amongst all these people, I think one thing I was struck by Dr. S. Ramanathan, Professor Eleanor Duckworth, and Jiddu Krishnamurti was the sense of the occasioning of attention and inquiry. The occasioning of attention and inquiry.